All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to talk about bark beetles today. We have a assigned reading that I've given you for the lab in your uh, field guide to Western bugs and diseases, insect and disease pests of Oregon and Washington conifers, pages 16 through 29. It's going to be really important that you read that. It's got a really good summary on bark beetles, what bark beetles do, their life cycle, this business of galleries. We're going to talk a little bit about galleries here, but I wanted to give you just a general overview of the ecology and some reminders about tree anatomy from forest ecology. So if you remember from forest ecology, right, a tree cross-section looks something like this, right? We have a stem. Most of the cross-section of that stem is made up of xylem, right? So this is the xylem. And that xylem is divided into two zones of heartwood and sapwood. So this would be the heartwood. And then we have sapwood outside that. Okay. And then we have that complex organ. Remember that the bark of a tree is an organ that is made up of several tissue types. And I'm not going to draw the whole thing, but you see the green layer there. That's the part that is bringing those photosynthetic products from the crown downward. That's the phloem, okay? So here's our phloem. And then outside the phloem is the really thick protective layer, also known as the outer bark. Okay, so we have the outer bark on the outside, the inner bark, which is the phloem, inner bark, okay? And bark beetles are an organism specifically adapted to feeding on that phloem layer and then that important cell division layer, the vascular cambium. So if you remember again from forest ecology, right in here is this zone right there that's doing all the active cell division for adding new xylem and creating new phloem, the vascular cambium. I'm just going to abbreviate that to VC, okay? So what bark beetles do is carve a niche or a groove into that cambium phloem layer, and that's called the gallery, specifically the egg gallery. And they lay their eggs in there, and then their larvae begin to feed on the most nutritious part of the tree. And some of you may remember that wood itself is really not very nutritious. Not a lot of critters are adapted to eating wood. But the vascular cambium layer and the phloem layer are somewhat nutritious, and this is where the bark beetles find their food they need to grow a new brood, new bark beetles, and make more. The other thing that happens with bark beetles is that they will introduce into the tree a fungus. Now that fungus is also part of their ecology. It provides nutrients for them. It also helps them overwhelm the tree. So when a bark beetle attacks a tree, not only do we see the consumption of and loss of the xylem and the phloem, but we see the vascular cambium and the phloem, but we see the growth of a staining fungi called blue sap stain. And blue sap stain will then grow in this sapwood. And remember that sapwood, what is the sapwood doing? It's bringing water from the root system up to the upper portions of the plant and the crown. So now you've got this fungi growing in the sapwood, and that prevents the water from flowing through the cells of the xylem in the way that it should. So we've got two things going on here that are killing trees. This is important for you to remember. How do bark beetles kill trees? Two ways. They girdle. Girdling is the consumption of that layer and the loss of that layer. All right? So we've got girdling through consumption. And then we have the plugging of the tree's waterworks essentially through the blue sap stain. So we just say introduce staining fungi. So this is not a wood damaging fungi. It's not a decay. We're going to talk about some decays later on. Those of you that had resource measurements, we talked about this blue staining fungi as something that degrades or devalues lumber, but it does not cause any structural defect. So in the process of this fungi growing through the cells via their connective pits, the tree ends up losing moisture to the crown. That further stresses the trees, which further brings more or increases susceptibility to bark beetles. So when you read that section over in the book, you're gonna hear them talk about primary bark beetles and secondary bark beetles. Primary being capable of attacking trees that are fairly vigorous, secondary bark beetles being capable of only attacking, recently killed or severely stressed trees. We've got a number of bark beetles that are on your required list. We put the major ones. All of them are considered primary bark beetles in some situations. They're capable of attacking healthy trees, but most of them are looking for trees that are stressed or weakened. All right, so let's just look at that basic life cycle and ecology of a bark beetle. Adults fly and seek out a host tree, okay? And the hosts we're going to go over in another video we have put together on bark beetles. But each group of bark beetles has, some have a single host, most have a few hosts, some have a broad array of hosts. The mountain pine beetle, for instance, is one of the broadest array of hosts of all bark beetles. Once the adults find a tree that is weakened, forest fire, lightning strike, drought stress, climate change, which leads to drought stress, root damage from construction, development. There are a variety of ways that trees can get stressed. Root diseases are another huge one, and we're going to talk about synergy between one of our bark beetles and root diseases here in Central Oregon. Once they find that suitable host, they create the gallery, emit pheromones, subject of one of our lectures, which is a attractant. In this case, it's an attractant. Now, pheromone doesn't always have to be an attractant, but in this case, it is an attractant to bring other beetles to the tree to help overwhelm the tree's defenses. And they lay eggs. Okay? Larvae, which you should remember from last week, this is the growth stage of those insects that have complete metamorphosis. The larvae feed on the phloem and the cambium. And once they have fed and matured to the point that they're ready to metamorphose, they go into a pupal stage. So they, what we call pupate. And they may overwinter in this phase, or they may emerge. Depends on the life cycle of the beetle. Some beetles have a very rapid life cycle and can complete possible 2 generations in one growing season, and that also changes with where you are latitudinally. So if you are further south, faster generations. If you're in Alaska, it may take 2 years to complete a generation. So the pupation occurs under the bark in small chamber called the pupal chamber, and then the next spring or later in the season, depending on the species, adults emerge and the cycle starts over. So that's the basic life cycle and ecology of bark beetles. There are a number of ecological benefits to having bark beetles that we'll talk about in the lecture material on orders and some of the things that, not on orders, on the role of insects in forested ecosystems. So there are important things that happen here, but obviously one of the big downsides is this can kill a tree, and it can kill large numbers of trees, and this is what leads us to consternation over large increases in bark beetle populations we refer to as outbreaks. All right, so in the next video, we're gonna go through how to identify bark beetles based on the signs that you see, because one of the things that's not gonna happen in this course to a huge degree is we're not gonna learn to identify insects by looking at the actual insect itself, with a few exceptions. We'll look at larvae of some wood borers, and certainly there are some distinctive insects in some of the groups. But by and large, we're identifying insects based on the damage that they do, the host that they're in, and the gallery pattern. All right, let's do that.